Hi everybody. So right now you know all about the basics, how to work with the DOM, how to create elements, remove elements, clone elements, and do basic DOM manipulation using a variety of JavaScript methods that we looked at. Now the next step, now that you have the basics covered, is to look at some more real-world scenarios. And one of the most realistic real-world scenarios we run into is how to take a bunch of data and turn them into visuals we see on screen. Now this is a very common part of the applications you probably use very regularly today, and this is definitely a common part of what we typically call dynamic apps, where we have the data drive what we ultimately see on screen. Now to make this a little bit more real, let's look at a few examples. And so I'm going to go ahead and launch, first of all, let's look at the website. Group.com has a search field. And the way I'm going to do this, I'm going to type in some results. Let's say let's type in a word, innerHTML, just for fun. Notice that as I'm typing in results, you now see data that happens to correspond to search results appearing below the screen. If I type in DOM, for example, you see data coming in and you see the visuals applied below. Now the part to kind of highlight is this. Before I typed anything in, the page had no concept of what results to display, how many results to display, and so on. As I'm typing in, the search service returns some data, probably in the form of JSON, and then I have some JavaScript that then takes that data and then turns into the visuals you see on screen that I can click and interact with. An example of how the page had no concept of what it needed to do, but as me interacting with it resulted in data that needed to be visualized. An example of what we're going to be learning about, where we go from data to visuals on screen. Now this is a more simplistic example and probably not the most exciting. Another app that is really great at taking data and helping you visualize it is Netflix. Now you may use Netflix quite frequently, and you know that there's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes. So when you launch Netflix for the first time, depending on what you've been browsing, depending on what data it has about you based on your preferences, there's no predefined page that contains all these videos, all these thumbnails. It gets generated for you as you're navigating and using the app. So here's an example where I'm in Netflix, I'm in the kids version where I can see all of my daughter's favorite shows. And if I click on movies, for example, notice that it takes a moment and then you see all of the movies currently appearing. Let me change the genre from, let's say, documentaries. You can see it takes a moment, it does some calculation, and then the elements get displayed on screen. Now, just like with the search example on the group.com website, the important part to note is that this page wasn't pre-generated. As I'm interacting with the app, the data gets loaded, that data gets mapped to, in the case of Netflix, thumbnails that happen to have some data when I hover over it that you can do more activities with. So two extremes of examples where you don't really have anything predefined, but as you're interacting with the app, you start to see some results. Now, there is something I want to highlight though as a part of it, and that is this. Before we look at the code, the general approach I want us to think about when we're making this all work is this. When dealing with a large quantity of elements, where for maximum performance, whether you're adding one element or a million elements, you want to make sure that all of your DOM updates are made at once. And that's one of the only tip I'm going to kind of provide right now, because as part of writing the code, we're going to look at other things that are going to come up, but this is the most important one, because when we are generating lots and lots of elements, the one thing to keep in mind is we want to keep the updates down to just one operation. And so with that, let's go ahead and go to our code editor. And so here I have a very simple example. Let me actually just give you a live version of what we're going to be thinking about. Now, we can look at this all theoretically and just start looking at some code snippets, but I think it makes a lot more sense by looking at a live example that kind of takes the essence of what both the search results and what Netflix highlighted and simplifies into where we have a very simple way of replicating a situation where we have some data and then we generate a lot of elements as a result of it. And so here, this example right now doesn't really have much going for it. We just have some text, quickly add elements, and it's a big generate button, and it's yellow. And that is almost inviting me to click on it. So I'm going to click on the generate button. When I generate it, notice that almost instantaneously, we see a bunch of data that appears here. Notice that it's about 1,000 elements, so it's going to take me a while to scroll all the way down. But notice what exactly it is that is being displayed. It's an emoji and then some random numbers next to it. Not the most exciting data to show, but the gist of it is valid in that we have some data and then we created some HTML elements to display it on screen with this kind of style that you see here, which is the sharp corners and then like a different background color and so on. So we'll get the learnings out of it from this example. And this also kind of distills the important parts of more realistic examples you might see in the future, where you might be calling an API that returns a lot of data, or you might be making a request to the server that then does some things that you will need to then process on the client side using JavaScript. Now I'm going to go back to the example we have here, where it's less functional because the functionality that we create. So here I'm in the video version of it, which is corresponding to what we'll be building. Click a generate button, nothing happens. All right, and now before we go and actually look at some of the approaches we have to make this work, let's look at the example itself. And so let's start with HTML. Our HTML for this example is nothing too fancy. We have some text, we have our button, an ID value generate items, and that makes up the top half of what we see here. And then we have the container div element. Now this container element is going to be it's going to house all dynamic elements we'll be creating in JavaScript that will be mapped from the data, put in the DOM form, and stuck in there. So this will play an important role in what we do. And then we have the CSS, which basically makes the application look the way it does, and nothing too fancy here as well. Typically HTML and CSS are a very important part of the applications that we build, but in this case though, the star of it is really going to be the JavaScript, because we are not going to be modifying the appearance or the structure of the document. What we will be doing though is looking at how to take data and put it in DOM form, and so the JavaScript is really going to be the star of what we'll be looking at. So our JavaScript right now, it's in the script tag. There's just a few things that it does. We have two variables, container and generate button, and what they do is they reference a DOM element for the container element, which is going to be housing all of the data that we turn to visuals, and then our button itself, that when you click it will then do something. And so we have an event listener with the click event that we listen for, and we call generate content on it, which means that when each time you click the generate button, the generate content event handler gets called. And lastly, we have the emojis variable, which is really just an array that contains a lot of the emojis we want to use as part of visualizing the data. All right, so now we saw an example of what we want to build, where we click the generate button, we click some data, and we also looked at what the code that we're starting from is going to look like. The bulk of what we're going to be doing is going to be in the generate content, where we're going to be creating all the DOM elements that goes into it. All right, there are two approaches on how we can take some data, create some DOM elements, and really quickly get them visualized on screen. The first approach is known as the innerHTML approach, and we're going to look at that first. So I'm just going to call it the innerHTML approach. Why is it all caps? Good question. I don't really know, but okay, I'll just make this approach better because it actually maps to an actual property value. All right, so in the innerHTML approach, what we do is this. We know we have to create some HTML elements, stick some data into it, and then get it displayed on screen. The way we're going to do that is we're going to be building what I like to call the DOM subtree, the DOM that's going to be generated to create the content that is ultimately going to be placed on the live version of what we see on screen. The way we're going to do that is by relying on text. We're going to generate all of this DOM content in text-based form, and once we've generated it, we're going to assign it to our container elements innerHTML property. So we're basically going to almost generate everything you want, just plop it directly in and just tell our browser, don't worry about it, this is valid HTML, I created it myself, and I'm going to go ahead and just have you display it. So we take care of all the processing on our own and let the browser just display it. So it's one of my favorite approaches for being able to make this work. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to call let HTML to add. This is going to be our variable that's going to host the string that we want to actually host all of our DOM content. And let's go ahead and just create another variable called let number of items. And this is the number of items we're going to be generating. And 1,000 seems like a pretty good number here. All right, now we're going to create a loop that's going to run 1,000 times to create the HTML that we want to ultimately have displayed on screen. So for let I equals 0, I equals less than number of items, and I++. Basic loop syntax. And so now I'm going to let num equals math.random times 1,000. This is part of the data I want to show, which is really an emoji mapped to a particular DOM element. what am I even saying? This is part of what we want to display on screen, which is a random number and emoji. This is us generating a random number. And then the emoji is going to be something very similar, where it's going to be emojis, and then math.floor, math.random times emojis.length. And what this does is that it just picks a random emoji from the list of emojis we have and assigns it to the emoji variable as part of us running it. All right, and now the last thing is going to be the HTML to add, and we're going to use the plus equals to keep adding strings to what we have already. And I'm going to use the template literal syntax, which is the backtick, and I'm going to say div class equals item, and it's going to be close p and $ emoji close bracket. This is going to make sure we have the appropriate image displayed, space num, so image and the number, and then we're going to go and close the elements that we have here /div. So what I'm essentially doing is constructing the HTML that will be used to house each of the items, and then for each time we loop it, keep generating more of the HTML as we're going along. So you can imagine that by the time all 1,000 times this loop have run, there'll be 1,000 streams of this HTML currently displayed. All right, so the last thing we're going to do is, now we're outside of our loop, is set all of the HTML we generate to the innerHTML property of our container element. So container.innerHTML equals HTML to add. Now, before we go too far, let's go ahead and make sure this actually works, because again, I'm coding live and there's going to be some things that may not work. Let me refresh the page. Let me hit generate. Okay, I hit generate. You can now see all of the examples in all of the code being shown right here. Now, the reason this works is that actually, before we look at the reasons that work, let's go ahead and look at the DOM and inspect what exactly is going on here. So I'm going to bring up inspect. I'm going to bring up the console. Actually, no, just the elements. Let's zoom in a bit. If I remember the keyboard commands for that correctly. And if we look at our body element and look at the contents of container, notice what we see here. We see div class item, and then inside that we have the p element with our emoji and the content that we have displayed at the very top. And so you can see 711467, the random number that gets generated. Now, where this all comes from is entirely from what we have currently defined. I'm going to go to close the console again. The dev tools, I mean, is what we have defined right here. HTML to add, div class item, emoji, num, and so on. And this is a critical part of really what makes this work, is that at the end of it, our HTML to add, that string is going to be massive. In fact, if I were to just kind of visualize it for you right now, if I just type in HTML to add, oh, of course, it's not a global variable. So let's go ahead and actually go into sources. You're seeing all kinds of stuff that I'd neither rehearsed nor have planned on showing, but I'm going to set a breakpoint right here and go ahead and hit refresh, hit generate. Okay, go to console. Let's type in HTML to add, and notice what you see here. You see a massive string with every single combination of what we created from the emoji and random number displayed in string form. So that's really what HTML to add currently displays. Now, why am I showing you that? I just want to highlight one more time that how this approach works is we generate the HTML in whatever quantity it needs to be, and then we do one operation, which is container innerHTML equals HTML to add. We're not adding this HTML to our DOM every single time we generate it. We are just continuing to make our variable HTML to add really large, and then we set its value to what we see at the bottom. So this is one really fast way for being able to take a lot of data, which in this case is 1,000 items, and then have it display on screen. Now, let's say we just make it 10,000 items, because why not? When it's being 10,000 items, let's refresh this page, hit generate. And notice that this takes slightly more time. There was a small pause before something showed up, but now you can still see though the results came up very, very quickly. And just like before, if I were to take a look at what the value of HTML to add would be, this time there will be 10,000 versions of whatever this HTML needs to be to make the example work. So pretty neat there. So now let's look at the second approach. And this approach is more traditional. It makes it work in a case where you want to use DOM elements and DOM manipulation methods to make this all work. So I'm going to delete all of this. And this is going to be, this has a name as well. I like to give names to all of our approaches. This is called the document fragment approach. Now, what document fragment is, if you've never used it before, it's known as a virtual DOM element. It doesn't really exist, but it's you can use it in JavaScript. You can call DOM manipulation methods on it to add things to it, just like you would any kind of a container. But when you add this document fragment to any other element in the DOM, it disappears. All that really ends up showing up in the DOM are the contents of document fragment, any children might have had, any peers it might have had, but the document fragment itself goes away. It's virtual, invisible. It's really great. It's a great helper to allow you to get things done, but then it just goes away and allows you to focus on the content. And we'll see more of it right now. All right, I deleted all for content. Let's refresh the page, hit the generate button. Nothing's happening. Perfect, exactly where we want to be. And so for this one, I'm going to create a variable called let fragment equals new document fragment. So this fragment variable now contains a reference to a document fragment object where we can do all the DOM manipulations we want to do. So let number of items, just like before, equals 1000. All right. And so in this case, let's go and create a loop that I equals 0, I less than number of items, I plus plus. Probably need to go and delete all of that earlier, but I did anyway, so I'm going to do this again very quickly. Let num equals math.random times 10,000. Let emoji equals emojis bracket math.floor math.random times emojis dot length. I do apologize for you having to see that one more time, but when you don't plan it properly, sometimes you kind of delete things you don't mean to delete. All right, let's go ahead and now do the things that can be very document fragment specific. Now, because document fragment is in many ways a DOM element, the way we do all of their work is to, just like we would any kind of a DOM manipulation. So we know that the way we display our data is we have a div element, then we have a p element, and within the content of the p element is where we have the number and the emoji and all that goes with it. And so first I'm going to create a div element. Div element equals document dot create element, and it's going to be div. Okay. And div element, remember our div element had a class value, and its class value was item. So div element class list dot add item. Okay, so we have our div element created. Next, let's create our p element. Let p element equals document dot create element, and it's going to be p. Perfect. And then p element, this is where we have the variables for num and emoji coming in to display the content that we want to do. So that inner text, that's a great property for setting the value of a text element, equals, in this case, $ emoji space and $num, basically using the template variable syntax, and close it, and now we have our inner text displayed. Now, simply creating elements doesn't actually do anything. It just happens to float somewhere in the nether regions of JavaScript's internals. And so what we need to do is make sure we add them to like a parent-child relationship. So div element dot append child is p. It's going to be a p element. So this ensures that when we look at the div element, it has a child element, which is the p element, which maps to the HTML we were trying to build earlier. And the next step is to do fragment dot append child, and then div element. So the document fragment object we created earlier is going to be housing our div element itself. And now this runs 1,000 times, so you can imagine that our document fragment is going to be have a collection of children that are going to be the div element, which in turn has a child of the p element below it. Now the last thing we're going to do though is, all this is great, we're doing all this stuff properly to create our document fragment, but to actually have it show up in our example, we need to add it to our container element. So container.add append child, and it's going to be fragment. Okay, so let's go ahead and refresh the page. Let's see how this all works, because this last step here after loop runs is where we actually are committing all the DOM trees that we created into the actual element we want to show up on screen. We generate, and yep, just like before, you now see a lot of content appearing. Let's just increase it to 10,000 items, refresh the page, hit generate. Again, very slight pause, but still very fast. All the elements have now made their way onto the screen. So you have the document fragment approach as well. Now, before we wrap things up, there's an important part of all this that we didn't really cover, and that is, how do we remove elements? For example, the way we have it right now, each time I hit generate, more and more elements will be created because we just keep appending onto what we have in our document right now. And so there are many ways we can look into removing elements, but there's a really modern, really quick way, and that is by calling the element that we want to clear all the children on, container, and then use replace children, and with no arguments. So container replace children is essentially going to say each time I click on this button, before any new content is generated, go ahead and clear everything out from it. Refresh the page, generate, and you can now see, well, it is actually really hard to see clearly. So let me just put number of items as 3, refresh the page, generate, you see 3 items here, hit generate again. Same 3 items are not being displayed. We're not adding more 3 items, but you can see that it's being cleared and new 3 items are being generated each time. So just as an FYI to keep in your, keep under your hat, container.replace children, or more specifically, the replace children method called in any DOM element will very quickly clear out all of the content it has inside of it, so you can go ahead and make the changes that you really want to do. And so with that, let's go back to our slides and start wrapping things up. Keynote. And so we look at 2 approaches for being able to take some data and display them on screen: innerHTML and document fragment. Now, which approach you want to use, it really depends entirely on what exactly you're trying to do. The content you're trying to add is going to be pretty static, like it was in the case of what we were doing, which is really we're just replacing the content with an emoji and a num value, but everything around it is pretty similar. The very text-heavy innerHTML approach works just fine because I'm not modifying the class value based on the condition, nor am I changing the elements based on whatever is happening in my application. It's just the same chunk of DOM element, which is really div and a p tag with some content that's just being replicated thousands of times. innerHTML works great. But you may be in a situation where the content you're generating will have a lot of variation. You might have different attributes you're setting based on a condition. You might be having different content or even different DOM elements come into the picture based on what exactly it is you're trying to visualize. In those cases, the flexibility offered by document fragment is actually quite good. Now, when you think about performance, we started off by saying we want to look at 2 approaches that are really, really fast. Which approach is faster? It really depends. It depends on what kind of data you're showing, how much data you have, and how complicated what you're trying to display is as well. In both the approaches, the variation is very minor because the main tip that we started off by saying is that no matter how many elements you're adding, you want to make sure you're essentially adding to the DOM just once. Holds true for both the innerHTML approach and the document fragment approach. We're making an update to our live DOM only once. Everything else is calculations that happen behind the scenes. And so definitely instrument, test your code, see which approach happens to be faster for your situations. But in my testing, both document fragment and the innerHTML approach, both of them are quite good and quite fast. So you don't have to over optimize for performance unless you're seeing something really bad, in which case definitely choose one over the other. And with that, if you have any questions about how to create DOM elements or just anything web development related, post in the forums at formatgroup.com, where I and others would be happy to help you out. If you like this video, tell your friends and enemies all about it. Hit subscribe to be notified of new videos with a notification bell. Click on that as well. Follow me at Krupa on Twitter and other places you might happen to find me, where you can get bite-sized updates on web development topics or pictures of my cat. And lastly, if you enjoy watching videos, if you enjoy reading content online, you may also enjoy reading them in book form, in paperback and Kindle editions. I have a bunch of books here. This particular topic is a big part of JavaScript, Absolute Beginner's Guide, because DOM manipulation is a core part of being successful as a JavaScript developer. And so it's covered there, but all the other books are pretty cool as well, though I am a pretty biased source for that opinion. And with that, I will see you all next time.